Eucharist is a word that often figures in our lives. As people of faith, we speak of the Eucharist. The Eucharist, for some of us, means the Mass. In the old days, people spoke of hearing Mass, suggesting perhaps that if you stood even at the back of the church, perhaps even outside the door of the church, as long as you could hear the priest speaking, in some sense you were attending Mass. And that served its purpose in its day. But today, we look at Mass as being more than just being present in the church, but rather being part of the celebration. So what is Eucharist? Eucharist is about communion and thanks. That word communion suggests community. Community is what we find in family. It's what we find in community groups, sports groups, the hurling group that we are part of in the GAA, the baking group that we're part of in the community circle. It also means being part of society. And in these days of the COVID-19 pandemic, we were never more aware of being part of a single united community, the community of the Irish people who are pulling together in their best efforts to reduce the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. This sense of communion, though, is not just about communion with our fellow people, but also our communion with God. And in the Gospel of St. Matthew, chapter 26, we have the account of the Last Supper. Jesus, as he prepares to undergo the torments of the suffering, the crucifixion and death, and then, of course, the great hope of the resurrection, what does he do? He gathers his closest friends around him, his closest followers, and he celebrates the Last Supper. He invites them to join him for a meal. Now, in the celebration of the Last Supper, Jesus is following the Jewish custom of the Passover, but he's also following the Jewish custom of sharing the meal. So that meal would have started with a loaf of bread taken by Jesus and broken. And in the breaking of that bread, Jesus takes a portion and then shares that bread around the table. So all are sharing in the one meal. This is communion in action. This is community sharing together and bringing out what is best about people working together. Similarly, Jesus shares the wine. So in the Last Supper, we have the breaking of bread, we have the sharing of the cup, and then we have Jesus saying, "Do this in memory of me." Words which at the time would not have made great sense to the community around the table of the Last Supper. But the sense of those words, "Do this in memory of me," make a lot more sense to us nowadays. So when we copy the example of Jesus in the Last Supper, what we are doing is gathering together in community. We are sharing in the body and blood of Christ, which is our spiritual strength and nourishment. But most importantly, we are then going to try and continue that sense of community in the world around us, in the people we share our lives with, in the example we set in our lives. So Eucharist then is more than just hearing Mass. Eucharist then is more than just being present at Mass once a week or more often as the case may be. Eucharist is about sharing in community with those believers around us and bringing the example of that sharing into our daily lives. So hopefully in our community, the community that we are part of, those who share our lives with us have an experience of Christ in our company, in our lives and in our example. Let us not just share the Eucharist, but live the Eucharist.